Hola chumbatas! It's Mr. Welch with my mad musings, and this time I'm talking Cyberpunk. I decided not to have a weekly talk about the different RPGs, just talk about whenever I want to, because there's a lot I really want to talk about, and I really don't want to wait around, so I'll just throw these up whenever I can. And the role-playing game de jour is Cyberpunk 2020, effectively written in 1990, where the second edition is what people consider the best. There was a first and a third edition, but nobody really remembers the first edition, and nobody really wants to remember the third edition. But 2020 was voted the 10th best role-playing game of all time. If you were playing RPGs in the 90s and you wanted to play a dark future, you had two options, Cyberpunk and Shadowrun. Shadowrun had the longer shelf life, but a lot of people preferred the hard tech feel of Cyberpunk. There's no magic in Cyberpunk, it's all meat and metal, and that's all you got. As you would expect in a dark future game, this is a crap sack world where everything's bad. There's not a lot of food, everybody's crammed together, there's a lot of high technology, but everybody's poor if you're the nobodies, and if you are the upper rich elite, then you don't really care about anybody but yourself, and you will sit around and fiddle while the rest of the world burns. Most of the world is a toxic wasteland. There's large portions of it that are just nuclear or biological hazards. The world's just coming through a crippling depression. Of course, in Cyberpunk, there has to have been a brush war down in South America that didn't end well for the United States. Corporations effectively run everything. There's pockets of anarchy all over most major cities. Outside the cities, there's nothing but bandits and raiders. And that's on a good day, but that's where you grow up and that's where you're going to play. The system itself is stat plus skill. You add your stat and your skill together, you roll a d10, and you try to meet a target number. Pretty simple stuff, nothing exotic. You have 10 roles or classes that you can choose from, but the only real difference between them is when you start off, you have different class skills that you can purchase from, that you get a certain amount of skill points to buy from. Also, you have your special ability, which is unique just to your class. So if you're a solo, you have combat awareness. MedTech has MedTech. If you are a techie, you get to jury rig. Corporates get resources, and so on. All your class skills that you can pick can be bought by anybody once the game actually gets started. Only your special ability is restricted to your class alone. You have a life path, which is pretty much 1 year after you turn 17 until your character starts, and this is basically a subplot generator, I'll be honest. Sometimes you get something mechanically good, sometimes you get something mechanically bad, but most of the time it's contacts or life happenings that you can reflect back on, and adds more to the game later. When you're doing your session 0 to see how you want to play Cyberpunk, you are going to need to discuss the scope of the game, because there's so many ways to play this game, it's not funny. And if you go in wanting a military style campaign with all the goodies there, and everybody else wants to play a street level campaign where you usually don't have enough money to buy all the rounds for your magazine, it's going to be a little bit tricky to mix those two campaigns together. That's extremely important because the game is exceedingly lethal. Bullets take limbs off if you get hit. If you get hit in the head, it takes double damage. So it only takes 4 points of damage to kill you, minus any modifiers you might have. And even then, the modifiers don't usually add up to the point where you're not painting the walls brain matter gray if you get hit in the head with a 9mm hollow point. If you're playing a low-powered game where you're street runners and you're trying to just survive, you're not going to have a lot of firepower, and you're not going to have a lot of body armor, and you're definitely not going to have a lot of cyber. But then again, neither is your opponent. So if you're all street gangs running around fighting for scraps, nobody's going to be sporting a assault rifle or just full-on Metal Gear body armor. If you wanted to play a Militech or Lazarus Group mercenary-style campaign where you were jumping in full body armor with all of your military weaponry, with air support and artillery support, yes, it's going to be a lot more deadly, but you're also going to be having a lot of the cyber tech or the body armor that will protect you. So you really got to get the scale right. One thing to watch out for is you do not want to allow everything possible in this game into your campaign, because there is a lot of stuff out there that just throws the balance completely off. And I'm looking at the power armor book, so watch out for maximum metal if you're going to be playing this one, because some people like to have the power armor, so it's kind of more of a Japanese style, but that power armor will shred most parties, and if you run across a bad guy with one, it can be a TPK in less than a round. This game, more than most, you need to work on the balance before you start playing the game, or else you're going to end up with a lot of dead PCs and a lot of angry players. The game is memorable largely because it's the one that gave us cyberpsychosis. In Shadowrun, if you put in too much cybernetics, you just die. In this one, the more cybernetics you put in, it has a humanity cost. And the more humanity cost it has, the more your character loses its empathy trait. And if empathy trait hits 0, you go nut job. Usually you just go berserk and start killing everybody, but sometimes you go Norman Bates and are quiet and shy and then slaughter people when they're in their sleep. And the insidious part of it all is that for the most cybernetic implants, the loss is random. You can get lucky on a cyber arm, which loses 2d6 and only lose 2 humanity cost. For every 10 you lose a point of empathy. So some of them, you might get lucky, not lose anything. Others, you could go in for a simple minor procedure and lose an entire empathy point. Metal is one of the few ways to actually increase your stats. There's a few stats that you can't increase, but for the combat ones like reflex or speed or body, you're going to need cyber. And of course, it's a trade-off between effectiveness and humanity cost. So the more cyber you put in to make yourself deadlier, the less human you become. And it becomes obvious when you've lost almost all of your humanity, because then you are not passing any empathy checks at all. And you stop caring about things like taking prisoners or not using area of effect weapons near your friends. If you lose too much empathy and you start flirting around with cyberpsychosis, the powers that be will notice. And if you go watch the Cyberpunk 2077 video, which has been up for years and which they really need to get around to releasing because I'm fiending for it, you get to see C-SWAT, or MaxTac as they call it, in their full glory, where it shows they really don't mess around with cyberpsychotics and just tend to open fire with highly explosive, high-powered weapons. The other major aspect of the game, of course, is the net, which is always a staple of cyberpunk games like this, where you are interfacing directly with the World Wide Web through your cyber modem. This gives you insanely fast speed. The only problem is the bad guys can send things through your feed and boil your brain. And this is handled by playing the net runner. Having a cyberpunk campaign, especially one based on the works of Walter John Williams, you have to have somebody that can directly interface with the internet. Shadowrun has Deckers, Cyberpunk has Netrunners, you've got Johnny Mnemonic which does it, The Matrix, which is pretty much all about net running. Not having a Cyberpunk campaign without Netrunners would be like having a Star Wars campaign without lightsabers, a Firefly campaign without ethical dilemmas, or a Star Trek campaign without beating us over the head with moralistic preachings. The downside is, and this applies to just about every game that has it, is when the Netrunner goes on, the game grinds to a halt for everybody else, because the Netrunner is literally on another plane of existence by being inside the net. So everybody's sitting around waiting for him to unlock the door or to get the secret file, and play-wise, there's not a lot to do while that's happening. The game, as a rule, says when you're playing the Netrunner, have one turn in the net, have one turn in reality. The problem is, in the game rules themselves, a turn in the net is maybe a second, where a turn in real life is about 5 seconds. So the Netrunner would get like 5 actions for every one that a regular player has. And some of the net actions are pretty complicated, especially when you get into the net combat, where you have to res or de-res programs to fight the programs that are trying to wreck your deck or boil your brain. How do you reconcile this? I really don't know, because everybody who's ever played it has always had the same complaint. That dilemma seems to be hardwired into not just this game, but every game that has that mechanic. When it's Netrunner time, everybody else goes and gets a sandwich. The beauty of the game, and the reason why it's remembered so fondly, in fact it's regarded so well, is just the depth that Mike Pondsmith wrote it. It's all about style over substance. They have rules for staring people down, so if you wanted to do the good, the bad, and the ugly final scene to see who's going to win the three-way showdown, only this time with cybernetic eyes flicking back and forth, and everybody's got a semi-automatic hand cannon that's getting ready to blow holes in each other. This is the game for it. Life is extremely cheap in this game. You pretty much have a 1 in 10 chance of dying every time a bullet catches you. So the trick is don't get shot at to begin with. The stuff that can keep you alive from all of the dangers is either dangerous to your health in the form of cybernetics driving you insane, or highly illegal, so if you try to strap on military-grade body armor, the police are going to want to have a talk with you. You are nothing in this game, and you can easily be replaced. You have to remember that, because that's the way the corporations think. If you get too powerful, if you get too nosy, if you become a liability at all to any of the corporations like Arasaka or Biotechnic or Militech, they will try to remove you. It is very much a theme being you against the big guy. You are the little ant, they are the boot, and they are going to try to step on you if you try to get in their way. But that's the reason why you're playing Cyberpunk, is because you are fighting the good fight against the implacable foe. You want to stop the corporation from using homeless people as test subjects for drugs or weapons or worse. You count the number of bullets in your magazine and hope you can pick up some on the way, because you've got to take them down. And no matter the odds, you're still got to try. Pondsmith wrote books covering most of the classes in detail, as well as a good chunk of the world. Unfortunately, the game came to a grinding halt when they decided to upgrade to 3.0, which was it was definitely viewed as a downgrade. You're not going to find many people that'll say a lot of nice things about 3rd edition. It was rushed, it was obvious. It was so obvious that they had used Barbie dolls for filler art, and they never replaced it with the art. So all the art in 3rd edition is literally Barbie dolls. Stick with 2nd edition. They had a Cyber Generation game book, which kind of turned it into Super Kids, which wasn't well regarded. And there was also a third-party publisher, which turned it into kind of like the World of Darkness with Cyberpunk. That wasn't received very well. Cyberpunk fell into the CCG trap that was in the early 90s because everybody wanted to be Magic. They did come out with Netrunner, which along with Jihad was the sister game, the only 2 other Deckmaster games, as well as Magic the Gathering. It was actually considered one of the finest CCG collectible card games ever written, and the cards, even today, go for a lot of money if you have any. The original ones, not the ones done by Fantasy Flight, the Cyberpunk ones. As part of the CCG fad, R. Talsorian did make a game book that was tied into their collectible card game with Rashi Bartmoss's Brainware Blowout. It wasn't bad, and they didn't try to refocus the entire game based around the card game, which is something that other games like Deadlands or 7th Sea did, and it really reflected badly on those games. Sadly, the game kind of went out at its peak when it started to transition to 3rd edition. Yes, it had its flaws. The game is notoriously easy to min-max. You just put everything into reflex and everything into whatever combat skill you're doing, and you're never going to miss the other player. Everybody goes straight for the assault rifles, and if a game master doesn't put a limit on the firepower you do, you'll be gunning mooks down like nobody's business. Escalation was a real problem with the game because everybody's going for the 66 dice of damage instead of the 2d6 9mm damage. People forget the players are small time usually. If they start to get uppity, the big powers will send things that they cannot handle after them. You gotta let your players win some, but you also have to remember if they piss off too many people, somebody's gonna put a missile through their window. There are so many supplements, I would say that it would be hard to pick out the best one, but that would be a lie because there's the Night City Sourcebook, which is the masterpiece of game design and one of the best role-playing game supplements ever designed. Not just for Cyberpunk, I'm talking about all supplements ever, in any setting, any genre. It is just one of the most beautiful written, edited, and designed books of all time. It's set up like a web page with everything's linked. Literally, when you go to one part of the book and you say, I want to look into this, it will have tabs on the side to tell you what pages those topics are on. So if something links to one of the topics on the page you're written at, you can just go follow the tab. That will take you straight to the page you want to read, and then that'll have even more tabs. So you can pretty much reach any part of the book from any particular page within just a few flips. It has some background information about the city, about the gangs. It has rules for things like taxi service, police response times, all of that. But the beautiful part is it lays out the entire city and pretty much gives a story for every single building that has an occupant in it. It goes into insane amounts of details. Anything from how many stars a particular restaurant has, or what's the police response if you try to break into this building. If you get bored, just open up the book and start flipping pages until you find something interesting for the party to go investigate, rob, or get attacked by. If you want to get a copy of the Night City source book, save up your money because it goes for $100 plus easy. It is one of my prized possessions for my collection, and I will fight people who try to take it. Other books that stand out in the series, listen up you primitive screwheads, aside from being one of the greatest book covers of all, even if they did steal it from Army of Darkness, gives you tips on how to roleplay, or how to run rather, a Cyberpunk campaign. It gives you really good advice, though some of it's a little heavy-handed for the people that don't like trouble players. Wildside is the fixer source book, but it also covers how to run a poor campaign, and I mean poor as in everybody's broke, not it's a crappy campaign. Protect and Serve gives you the cop source book. Not a lot of people like to play cops because those are the good guys, in theory. And so if you wanted to play a cop and you can't really look the other way, this tells you how to play a cop in a less than legal campaign. The game isn't that hard to find on secondary market, and according to sources which just came out, they're going to be re-releasing the updated 2020 source book, which is, I think they called it Cyberpunk Red, since it's going to be coming out as a video game eventually, in theory. They're trying to hype it up, so if you see the re-release of the updated 2020 source book, grab it. As soon as it comes out, grab it. Most of the supplements you can still get for list price. If you go to the Artalsorian website, they have their shop. It's not easy to find on their website. It's not laid out that well. But if you look and you find the store, there's a lot of books that are still on there for list price, brand new. I don't put too much faith in the third-party adventures. There's a few of them that are okay, but most of them aren't. Of the third-party modules, probably the best one was Chrome Berets, where you have to serve as military contractors in a brushfire war somewhere that's supposed to be the Philippines. For official modules, you want to look at Tales from the Forlorn Hope, which is a series of adventures all tied to this one veterans bar. If you like the dark future settings, if you liked Altered Carbon, or you liked Blade Runner, or going out into the wilderness and you want to do the Mad Max, this is the game that you want to play. The rules are simple, but you cannot have stupid players play this game because they will die quickly. Players are soft and squishy, and bullets tend to take limbs off. The game is so lethal, it has 10 stages of dead, anywhere from only somewhat dead all the way to chunky salsa. If you do not take cover, you are going to be in the chunky salsa version of death really quickly. The game's got a little bit of rust because in 1990 they didn't expect everybody was going to be walking around with the entire internet on their cell phone. So you'll need to house rule a little bit of it to get rid of that rust. There's also a few more house rules. For example, the cool stat really doesn't have any purpose, so you have to add one, especially if you're in the middle of a firefight. You can have people roll to see if they freak out. Personally, I also allow players to buy stats up by spending 100 points times current level, so if you wanted to raise your empathy from 7 to 8, it would cost you 700 points. Always found it a little bit strange that no matter how much you pump iron, especially if you're a little weakling, your strength will never go up, so you have to rely on cybernetics. So that's a minor tweak that doesn't really see that much play, but enough of it to make it useful. And that's Cyberpunk 2020. It has the well-earned reputation for being a dark future masterpiece. It's lethal, it's very thematic, it has some extremely well-written supplements, but it did kind of write itself into the corner, which is another reason why I don't like meta plots that change things too quickly. It's still mostly available, and more importantly, it's going to be restarted once the video game hits, or hopefully even sooner. So it's something to look forward to if you like Cyberpunk and you like science fiction role-playing games and really haven't seen anything that has struck your fancy, because dark future games really haven't been a thing lately, but with some of the Netflix stuff, it's starting to come back into vogue. I was going to try to get Star Wars out for May the 4th, but I had real life interfere. So next one I'm going to do is Star Wars D6, which is, as far as I know, still the second best-selling role-playing game of all time, despite the fact it's been out of print for a while. That game was so good that George Lucas made parts of it canon in his movies.